Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. With us now from Washington is the former National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a Center for Strategic International Studies counselor and trustee. Dr. Brzezkinski co-chairs the CSIS Advisory Board. And Dr. Brzezinski, welcome back to Newsmax TV.
Nice to be with you.
Well, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has warned that any prolonged shutdown of the government could affect the U.S. internationally. His warning comes after the president was forced to cancel his trip to Asia. Is the shutdown in Washington hurting U.S. foreign policy in your view?
It is beginning to hurt it. I don't think it's hurting it tangibly, but it's creating increasing uncertainty about the United States. And the loss of confidence in the United States is itself damaging to the United States.
Let's talk about Iran. Nuclear talks with Iran commence in Geneva next week. President Obama has spoken with Iranian President Rouhani. Secretary of State John Kerry has spoken with his counterpart. Are the Iranians sincere about negotiating on their nuclear program?
I think they're serious, but of course their expectations may be different from ours, and that's the whole purpose of negotiations. However, I think it is important to recognize that these negotiations will not succeed if their main purpose is to humiliate Iran and to put it in some sort of an inferior position in terms of the international standards. I think what is appropriate and correct and should be insisted upon is that Iran lives up to the same standards that other members of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, respect and abide by. And I think on that basis we can reach some sort of an agreement.
Now, there's a proposal on the table that involves Iran lowering its enrichment levels from 20 to 5%. In exchange, Iran wants international economic sanctions lifted or eased. How would you advise President Obama in dealing with Iran here?
I think there has to be some quid pro quo. If we expect the Iranians to do such things, then obviously we have to be responsive to what is clearly motivating them, namely the desire to avoid a socio-economic calamity at home because of the sanctions. The sanctions have been effective, but their purpose is to achieve an objective, which I think is an accommodation. Their purpose is not simply to rub Iran's nose in the dust. So we have to be sensitive. The element of pride is very important in such negotiations.
And what would the fallout of an agreement like this be for Israel?
If the agreement is reached, it's all to the good for Israel. Because after all, it's in the interest of Israel that there be no conflict with Iran in the area, either directly between Israel and Iran, or because we are drawn into it. Any such conflict would be highly unpredictable in its consequences and would create prolonged instability in the Middle East.
Do you see Israel striking Iran over its nuclear program in the future?
Most Israeli military leaders almost unanimously have said that an Israeli attack on Iran would be absolutely stupid and counterproductive. And I think they're right. And the president of Israel, President Peres, who's a very solid, intelligent, highly respected senior statesman on the world scene, is clearly not in favor of it. I don't see what exactly an Israeli attack on Iran would produce, except really dynamic spreading dangers in the region.
Dr. Brzezinski, we're hearing reports that the Obama administration plans to suspend a substantial portion of U.S. military aid to Egypt after the summer crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu has voiced concern about this. How do you view this decision?
I think it's very difficult for the United States to provide significant military assistance to the Egyptian military at a time when there are very ambiguous, to put it mildly, very ambiguous political events transpiring in Egypt involving the use of force and a lot of lethality, a lot of people being killed. So I think the United States is acting prudently, and in doing so, it's acting on behalf of the region and not on behalf of any one particular state.
Doctor, some say that Egypt's revolution has failed. Is the Arab Spring dead, as some say?
When the U.S. media were beating the drums and blowing the trumpets in honor of the Arab Spring. I said many times on national television and otherwise that I think the Arab Spring is going to be followed by the Arab Winter. In other words, I don't think that the preconditions for genuine liberal type democracy exist in the Middle East. We're dealing with a very ambiguous and complicated phenomenon, which I call in my writings political awakening. It's the first phase of political awakening of large masses that are motivated by many conflicting emotions, some fanatical religious beliefs, some democratic aspirations, some social resentments, some ethnic hostilities, some historical grievances against colonial and other powers. All of that is a mishmash of emotions. And I don't think democracy, consolidated democracy, will be on the scene very quickly. It takes time for it to emerge, to take roots, and to be consolidated.
Turning to Libya now, where the Libyan Prime Minister has been freed after armed kidnappers abducted him today in retaliation for a U.S. Special Forces raid that seized a Libyan al-Qaeda suspect. How unstable is Libya right now, and how strong does al-Qaeda remain?
You know, I have no real way of judging that. There are all sorts of intelligence reports floating around, but I really want to try to answer you because my answer would not be based on any really responsible insights.
Given months of disturbing reports of violence and terror in the Mideast and Africa, including the tragic hostage crisis at the Nairobi Mall, is there a rise in Islamic fundamentalism that threatens the West? And what is your assessment of the Obama administration's response to it?
I think there is a rise of fundamentalism in Africa, spreading from the Middle East. And it's not a responsibility of Obama alone to deal with this problem. This problem has global dimensions. It has implications for the Europeans. Look at what is happening in Libya, which affects the French, the Italians. Look what has been happening in Mali, which affects particularly the French. Look at what has been happening in Somalia, which affects many other people, in addition to those I have mentioned. This is a larger phenomenon, and I think we'll be living with it for a long time. We shouldn't over-dramatize it. We certainly shouldn't succumb to the temptation of labeling all of it as Islamic jihadism or whatever, because that simply offends the Muslims and inclines them to view us as hostile to their religion. I think patience, prudence, ability to operate on a selective basis, depending on circumstances in different countries, all of that requires a lot of tact and patience.
Now, Syria has agreed to disarm its chemical weapons after President Obama threatened a military strike there that was averted with the help of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Are you concerned that the U.S. conceded too much influence over Mideast affairs to the Russians?
Well, do you think we have direct influence over the Middle East by the use of force? We've done that in Iraq, and look at the mess that President Bush #2 created in Iraq. Years after the so-called military operation, which was based on fraudulent claims, Iraq today is totally unstable, continuously the object of violence, with Iran much more influence in it than ever before, and with intensive and open hostility between the Saudis and the Sunnis in Iraq. Is that a sign of American leadership and influence in the region? I think the fact of the matter is that our influence in the region has been declining. And that very unfortunate war, which President Bush launched under false pretenses, is having dynamically destructive effects on our influence. So the issue is not whether the Russians are trying to push us out. The issue is whether we can find a formula with the Russians, the Chinese, the Europeans, that contributes to some sort of stability in the region in which our preeminent role will not be quite as evident, quite as dominant as it has been for the last few decades.
And Doctor, along those lines, in his speech before world leaders at the UN in September, the president said that the notion of American empire may be useful propaganda, but that it isn't born out of the administration's current policy or public opinion. Do you think that President Obama believes in American exceptionalism and in America's status as a superpower?
Well, what he said, I am sure he believes what he said, and I think there is a lot to the argument that America is exceptional. But exceptionalism doesn't mean necessarily global hegemony. I think we're no longer in an age in which a single power, no matter how influential, can act as a global hegemon. And we're learning that rather painfully currently in the Middle East.
And Doctor, last question for you. In the wake of Edward Snowden's revelations about American surveillance programs, the Obama administration said that NSA spying is essential. What role do you think that this massive electronic spying program should play in our national security policy?
That's a very complicated issue because obviously our right to privacy, our sense of individual identity can be challenged by governmental surveillance. But on the other hand, it is also a fact that terrorism is becoming more pervasive and a more serious threat. We have to find some sort of a balance between these two responsibilities and also obligations. I think that we have to be very sensitive to individual rights, and particularly to the right of privacy. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the fact that without looking into the various sort of international chatter that is taking place, and which includes occasionally people who are conspiring against us, without looking into that, we will be failing in enhancing our security and in making it more difficult for terrorists to strike at us. As far as Mr. Snowden is concerned, I would be more inclined to consider him as someone interested in civil rights if he had not moved first to China and then to Russia with his 4 computers, which contain a lot of information about our ability to conduct intelligence. His choice of these 2 countries, I think, disqualifies him insofar as the claim of being a whistleblower on behalf of democracy is concerned.
All right, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezkinski, thanks so much for being with us today.
Nice to talk to you, as always. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.